Over 6 billion people share our planet. Of these, more than 1.3 billion struggle to survive on $1 a day or less. In both the developed and the developing nations around the world, problems of economic inequity, environmental degradation, and globalization continue unabated. Is positive change possible under these conditions? Our speaker, Daniel Taylor-Ide, believes that it is. He and his father, Carl Taylor, have spent decades in impoverished areas across the globe, from Appalachia to Nepal, researching ways to help communities create cleaner, healthier, more prosperous environments. The culmination of their research is a new book, Just and Lasting Change, When Communities Own Their Own Futures, which presents a unique approach to effecting positive, sustainable development. Daniel Taylor-Ide is president of Future Generations, a community-based conservation and development organization in Franklin, West Virginia. He's also a senior associate at Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. He received his doctoral degree from Harvard University in Education and Development Planning. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Daniel Taylor-Ide.
Good evening. Not only terrorism and one rogue nation threaten our planet. Diseases increase, air quality, fresh water, biological species decrease. Almost every economy around the world slows down. Expanding numbers of people make all these problems worse. In parallel to all these perils, though, our world has promise. We are able to eradicate poverty, pestilence, and pessimism. The challenge is how. Most discussion today wallows in the various W's. Who is the bad guy? Where is the crisis? Why each came to be? When will the next catastrophe happen? We have many, many books on the W's. But this evening I want to address the how. How can we solve these problems? And as I come to the podium this evening here in Harvard Square, morning is breaking in Afghanistan, where my father, with whom I wrote this book, is starting a workshop in Kabul for senior officials of the government and members of the cabinet. My father's message in Kabul, as I speak here right now, is the same as mine. Decades of research, field observation, and historical experience show how community-based solutions can address the many unfolding crises. Let us go right now to the land of Afghanistan. There last fall, our staff brought in some troubling reports. In the Central Highlands, in valley after valley, poppies dominated the harvest. But poppies had never grown in the Central Highlands. Why were they growing now? The explanation that the villagers gave shows why the war on terrorism is having difficulty, why a new paradigm is needed to solve these problems. The villagers explained to our staff how after the bombing broke the Taliban control, the Al-Qaeda commanders called in their foot soldiers and told them to return to their mountain valleys. They said, the jihad against America will be fought with new weapons. Your profit will be 20 times higher if you take these poppy seeds and plant them instead of wheat. Then the new jihad will enter America through her blood veins. War on terrorism is a weak way to fight an enemy that is so adaptable as to change attack tactics in 1 year from airplanes to blood veins. None of those poppy fields were destroyed as our troops raced after the elusive bin Laden. This is not a war that can be fought as we have grown to know war. The answer to stopping terrorism, as is the answer to eliminating poverty, pestilence, environmental decline, and population growth, is to transform life at the community level, to change behaviors. And we know how to do this. In Afghanistan, where poppies were newly planted, one of our staff started a political party. He named the party Pagal Party. Now, Pagal in Farsi means mad, not just regular craziness, but mad as such with rabies. So if you are so crazy as to believe that a better world is possible, join the Pagal Party. The dues are 2,000 bricks. Returning soldiers, fed up with war, dug up the mud, pressed it into forms, and dried their bricks. They paid their dues. And together, members of the party used the bricks to build schools. Now, inside the schools, they teach literacy and numeracy, that which you would expect, but they also are teaching community organizing. Just as there is a cycle of plowing, planting, and irrigation that leads to the harvest each year, so too they are being taught that a 7-step cycle leads communities to work plans that allow them to build from their resources. The first work plan is so simple, but each year the plan can grow more sophisticated as the people learn how to do the planning process. Let me illustrate the types of actions that are possible using this simple community-based work plan process. Let me draw from the field of healthcare. In much of the world, simple interventions can prevent over half of child deaths. Mothers can care for dehydration from diarrhea, which had been the #1 killer. Village auxiliaries can treat pneumonia, which is now the #1 killer. And illness can be prevented by immunization, improved nutrition, and sanitation. Community-based action even provides hope for HIV/AIDS. And saving children's lives links to economic development, reduces burdens on women, promotes family planning, and perhaps most importantly, opens hope as communities see their lives changing quickly and at very low cost. Experienced practitioners in this audience may ask me after I stop speaking, but we have been doing that. Look at the decades of foreign assistance to Egypt, India, Colombia, the Philippines. Yet terrorism grows in these places along with poverty, pestilence, and pessimism. My answer comes back to the W's. We have focused on what is the problem, who is the culprit, and why it all happened. But we have been overlooking all the scholarship on the how to make it better. Abraham Lincoln is a perfect example that us Americans can use to understand the how. Lincoln used the crisis of the Civil War to introduce fundamental new directions. September 11th creates a similar opportunity where we can make a major redirection. Lincoln not only led us through the Civil War, not only released the slaves, he set in place policies that enabled communities across America to change. In fact, Lincoln spent most of his day governing the country. His administration did not set up programs to do the work for people. It did not give away massive sums of government money. Lincoln launched a range of initiatives that enabled communities so each one found its own unique solutions. Let me give you two quick examples. Lincoln recognized the importance of information, becoming the equivalent of an email junkie, often crossing the street from the White House to the telegraph office 3 times each day. Despite the Civil War, he opened communication services for all Americans. In 1861, he backed the Pacific Railroad Act. He followed that with construction of the transatlantic cable. He reformed the postal service with 3 classes of mail, easy communication using the postcard, and free home delivery in cities. To promote the economy, Lincoln's administration restructured the management of money, a national banking system, standard currency, the postal money order. The money order opened monetary transactions for ordinary people in America. Post offices all over the country issued money orders, creating an avenue for the safe transfer of small sums, allowing the citizen a secure way to move money from one place to another community. Other examples of Lincoln's focus on the how can be found in education and agriculture. Collectively, these policies enabled communities. As America emerged from the Civil War, we were not crippled in economy and confidence, as is true of many countries following the Civil War. Rather, we burst forward. Communities mobilized as towns, unions, congregations, and corporations. In Afghanistan, communities where Future Generations works are also mobilizing. They are creating local action committees, gathering data, prioritizing tasks, and making work plans. But to sustain this, they need support, and that is what our training program in Kabul is doing right now. It is teaching the government how to create a top-down enabling environment, just as it is teaching the Poggle Party about bottom-up, community-based action. The way to achieve this potential is not spending more money. We've thrown enough money at these problems to know how well that works. What is needed is to change the how of how we act. For the 1995 World Summit on Social Development in Copenhagen, Future Generations published 2 monographs with UNICEF and Rockefeller Foundation, describing the potential of community-based social change. For the last decade, we have learned more by implementing large field trials in Peru, India, and China. More recently, our book, Just and Lasting Change, When Communities Own Their Futures, provide a more detailed presentation. The growing evidence shows that a standard process with key principles can now be stated. Implemented systematically, this process creates solutions that are fitted to local economy, ecology, and values. Communities will not advance on their own. If they could have, they would have, long ago. Communities need enabling top-down support from government and outside-in, technical assistance and training. Action must build bottom-up from data, not opinions, not politics. And to collect this data for decision-making, communities need practical, rapid techniques. Finally, communities need a way to prepare work plans that change behaviors, for it is ultimately in behavior change that we can only achieve systematic and sustainable development. But these work plans must start simply, and then repeating the process grows more sophisticated each year. All these are how-oriented features, and they must be done together in an integrated process. This is not a blueprint that can be imposed from the outside, but collectively it can be taught to communities, to the governments, and to the agencies that are already present who are trying to help. This is a process that has occurred fortuitously in places like America, but our new field trials demonstrate that the process can be intentionally promoted and at a very large scale. In Peru, India, and Tibet, the work of future generations is showing that enabling communities is doable. We have started a new master's degree that is teaching this process and allowing people from all over the world to learn how to take it home and do it. Let me give you another example from Afghanistan, showing how this process works. In addition to the Pagal Party, which, by the way, is the only major initiative now underway in Afghanistan to work with ex-combatants, in the Southern Highlands, work plans are being led by the women. Women's literacy training is being organized through village mosques, and this training leads to work plans that address child care, microcredit, destroyed water systems, whatever presses upon the needs of that particular group of women. The how of community change is easily taught and allows each village to scratch where it itches. And then that village mobilizes what resources it has, brings factions together, and sets in motion village-based change. Can we in Afghanistan mobilize fast enough to stem the warlords from taking over? I just don't know. But what is exciting is that in these villages, and there are now hundreds of them, I do not believe so many poppies will be grown this year as last. The women are entering decision-making. Warlords are losing influence. Just as our military technology has created weapons that strike with precision, so too, in the last 50 years, our social change understanding has sharpened and allows precise, rapid, and locally targeted action at the community level. What really shocks me about all the talk regarding crisis is how we miss the role of communities. For it is through mobilizing communities in large numbers that we can remove the causes not only of terrorism, but also the environment, economy, and health. Crises that may in the long term and at larger scale be more dangerous than terrorism. We need to do this among the homeless on America's streets, the arid lands of our West, the poor in Appalachia, and our alienated youth just as much as we need to do this around the world, and we can. We have been focused for too long on the what, the who, and the why. We need now to put energy and resources onto the how, and this is fundamentally the enabling of communities. On their own, people cannot pull themselves up. Billions of dollars in do-gooder aid will not work either. But we have rapidly growing scholarship and real field evidence of what works. Doing so will create truly just and lasting change. Thank you very much.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Daniel Taylor-Ide discussing just and lasting change. Daniel, you mentioned a 7-step process that leads to a community building plan. I wonder if you mentioned a lot of places around the world. I wonder if you would walk us through this process in a particular community that you have been involved with, and talk about how the process works, how it got started, how long has it been going on, what major setbacks have you run into, how have you overcome them?
That's the whole book, Pat.
Well, give us a summary.
But The 7 steps were nothing that we discovered. What we did was, working with 2 task forces that have worked for many years, we noticed that these were common things that communities did. And so we said, oh, this seems to be regularly happening. And let me give you an example. Up in northeast India, along the Burma border, there's jungle up there just west of the country, just east of the country of Bhutan, south of the Tibetan border. And there in the state called Arunachal Pradesh, in northeast India, communities by the hundreds are starting this 7-step process. The first step is to create a local organizing committee. Sometimes it's just 4 people. But you get a group of people together as a committee that's going to work as a committee rather than having a single leader. If possible, you want as broad a representation as possible, but you work with whatever you get to show up. The second step in the process is that you look at your successes. Don't sit around and look at all your failures. Every community's got some successes. Okay, this is what we did. We made it through the last monsoon, whatever. Then this third step is that you look at successes in a nearby community or in some distant place, if somebody's willing to buy you a train ticket and take you someplace, so that you're getting new ideas coming into the community. And you do this systematically. Once again, you're looking at the positive, because that is what people grow from. They don't go from the World Bank mission that comes in and tells you everything that's wrong. The fourth step in this process is to go out and gather data. And we've come up with a series of very simple techniques so that you can get very complicated data. And since I'm talking about the group in northeast India, it's a jungle there. They're concerned about the deforestation in their jungle. How do they get good information about the trees, the plants, the trees, the water, the birds, the animals? And we found that tracking several birds is a very sensitive indicator, and creating them in a little fraction, one to the other. If you've got pheasants in the jungle there, you have a pristine ecosystem. When you have babblers, you've got an ecosystem in transition. When you have sparrows and crows, the human activities have totally taken over. So if you create little ratios between those types of birds, you've got a very sensitive indicator that's monitoring water quality, air quality, soil quality, and biodiversity. And that's something that gives you a number rather than an opinion, which is the way most people make decisions. And so step number 4 is to work from data, not opinions. Step number 5 is to take an effective decision and make a work plan. And the work plan I've talked about enough in the speech. Step number 6 is to start to implement the work plan and implement something with an objective that's doable. And step number 7 is to make mid-course corrections. Don't just follow the work plan blindly as you start to get information back in, and then start the cycle over again. Just as you would if you were doing some farming and you run the cycle over again. After 3 years, we're getting very sophisticated work plans that are done on one sheet of paper so that even an illiterate person can figure out what it says. And to put a sophisticated work plan on one sheet of paper, I suggest you read the book Just and Lasting Change.
Who are the partners in this enterprise? You mentioned experts, you mentioned NGOs. How do you bring these people together, and who comes from outside, who's already inside?
What we found was that you can never get the community mobilized on its own. I mentioned that. What the Soviet experience tells us, and many others, that you can never get government and top-down action to mobilize communities. But even the communities and the government working together in partnership is insufficient. Every single one of the 200 detailed case studies we looked at had a fly in the ointment. Some outside-in vector that was taking the top down and the bottom up. So we began to talk about the fact that you need a 3-way partnership, top down, bottom up, and outside in. Now, wherever possible, you need those to be local. partners because then it's sustainable. So you want to discourage the role of future generations coming in from North America and work with the local experts, local government. For the years that we were working in Afghanistan while the Taliban was in control, we had real problems with the local government, obviously. And so the projects there were never able, though we were working in Afghanistan, never able to go to scale. So if you really want to go to scale and move quickly, you've got to have all three partners. And if you don't have all three partners, then you're going to be sitting there going very, very slowly. And we have many examples of well-intentioned clinics and well-intentioned saints doing good work, but never really going beyond their particular locale.
I'm going to ask you to do one more thing before I open it up. You said go to scale. That's obviously code for something.
Thanks.
Would you unpack it for us?
Go to scale is to take a community project and make it into many. One of the real problems that many people have sort of cynically noted is that there are a lot of good pilot projects around the world, but the pilot project has never led social change. And so going to scale, as we use the term, means still sticking with a community-based action, but making that one become hundreds or thousands.
You're listening to Daniel Taylor-Ide discussing just and lasting change. The floor is now open to the audience. If you would line up at the microphone.
Sorry, Pat, can you say that again, please?
Okay. You are now listening to Daniel Taylor-Ide discussing just and lasting change. The floor is now open for audience questions, and please use the microphone in the aisle.
Thanks for your talk. I'm still a little unclear, though, on exactly what it is you guys end up doing. I think you need to be more specific with us. Give us an example of a community, an exact problem, or an exact group of people that you really came in and managed to affect lasting change with them.
Okay. Thanks for pushing the question. Let me go back to the situation in Northeast India, since I've used several examples out of Afghanistan. In the jungle that we're talking about, the communities invited us in and said they wanted to start this process. One of our experts went in, and a group of women sat around in a bamboo hut, and they said, okay, let's start this process. And so that the first step was there. The group was organized and together. They said, what have we done that's successful? And they listed a number of things that they had done that's successful.
Can you give us some of that list?
Right, okay. They said that, for instance, that they had a malaria problem. And some expert had come in and told them that if you want to get rid of malaria but don't have any money, you fill in all the puddles around the village, and that will get rid of the breeding ground of the malaria. And so they had noticed the breeding ground of the mosquitoes, which would lower the malaria. So they had noticed the previous year that they had less malaria than the year before. So they said, this is practical, it's doable, how can we start to build on this? Fine. Then the question came, they were excited about the improvements that they in that case had made in health. So then the next step, that was looking at their success. Then they said, where can we go in step number 3 in terms of what somebody else has done? So they said, they went off and they looked at some other programs, they got a lot of ideas, and then they got confused because they saw, microcredit, we're going to have to do a women's credit program. We're going to have to start and build a new school. We need an electrical generating system. And so their list became an impossibly long wish list because of step number 3, where they saw successes of other communities. Then in this particular village that I'm talking about, Sile is its name, they got to step number 4. And this is only a month into the process. It wasn't as though we were, especially when you start, you want to deliver some action very quickly. We said, let's get some data. And so we went around the village, and in this particular case, because they were interested in this area, we gathered data on all the kids who had died. And put them on a piece of paper in the bamboo hut. And lo and behold, there were a lot of kids dying from diarrhea. And it didn't take very long to figure out that it was cholera that was going around. So boom, a simple the data was up there, the numbers were there, we could name the houses where they were. It was clear that the cholera, the diarrhea that was killing their kids was related to a water source, because of the kids who used a certain water source were getting more, those families were having higher death. So immediately then, the next step in the process, step number 5, taking a decision and making a work plan, leads to protecting that water source. Fine, everybody's taxed a little bit. They dig out the water source, they put in a little black plastic pipe. This is not something where we're going to end up paying the bill as an outsider, because then we would have done something that's unsustainable. But what we're doing is to teach them the methodology. The black plastic pipe goes in. Then they start to monitor their kids. Deaths don't go up as the next year as they did the last year. Fine. So that the year after that, they say, wow, this will work. So then now they go through the planning process and they say, oh, our biggest problem is poverty. So next year they decide to take something a little more complicated. So when they do their work plan process and doing so forth, they keep some health care work going on. They decide to immunize their kids. They decide to do some maternal education. But they start to add more lines on the work plan as it gets more complicated. And they put in fish ponds so that they can get a source of money. And then the next year they're doing their fish ponds and they've already got their health initiatives working, and so they said, oh, we've been cutting down our forest, that's causing some problems, and so now they've started a program for growing medicinal plants under the shade of other trees that are in the area. As one starts to build onto the others, and they set these things up in cascade, and you can see real change. Is that enough?
That's more specific. That's what I was looking for. Now, have you encountered resistance to coming into indigenous cultures with these ideas? I would imagine that there might be that same kind of reticence that traditional missionaries might encounter.
My family...
How many of these ideas are actually being generated by your organization or the experts that you're working with on the outside in that you've mentioned, and how many of them are actually coming from this community organization that's starting?
My grandparents went to India 100 years ago as missionaries to do this sort of work, so I'm very familiar with the resistance issues that you talk about. What we try to do in this process is to create a mechanism where the problems are their problems. It's their scratch that they want to have itched, so that then they're enthusiastic for working in this direction. And that means they're going to use their own money and their own resources. If we're having to pay for the process to get done, then it's not going to be sustainable.
Okay. Thank you.
It takes all the time. I wanted to ask a similar question that both Pat and Jamie asked. And this is the partnership, which I feel is very important, and what Jamie mentioned about how the people react to your suggestions. Now, with all due respect to your grandparents, the missionaries to India, I think that your work is totally different, because the missionaries used to go to all over the world, and especially in India, that had a great civilization, and tell them how Jesus Christ Superstar is what they should believe now, and, would build a school or a hospital, not really having enough money to save their huge poverty and health problems and everything, but still, converting some to Christianity, as you know, especially in southern India, and the rest of Indians were resisting and resenting so much that they wouldn't even do the things that the missionaries had to offer that were very good, like literacy or health training or whatever. What you suggest is totally different. You go to northeastern India, in the jungle, everything is fresh. You get the women, they have the serious problems, and you don't push them. You don't say, Jesus Christ, our Christ, or America, Bush, or whatever. You say, these are your problems, this is what we could teach you. And of course, women are very, very, easily convinced, because they are the ones that suffer.
Right.
Women are oppressed in India, we all know that. So of course they take over and they save their babies and they save themselves and they save the world. Right. Their world and their jungle and their birds and all of that. And they're very aware of their ecosystem. I just came back from Costa Rica where you see the same thing. Right. But now, I have one question, and this is what Pat asked. The partnership seems to me a very difficult issue. Now, you said top, bottom up, and outside, inside, and all of that. Fine. Now, you go to a country, let's leave northeastern India, which I knew would be very successful without even telling me. Tell me about Afghanistan. Right. Now, you are in Afghanistan. You say that before you had the Taliban, so you couldn't be successful. Now, do you really believe that the government of Afghanistan right now represents the people of Afghanistan?
No, the government of Afghanistan right now is basically a mayor's office for the city of Kabul. And outside the city limits, you've got many, many different governments.
Now, my point is, how are these people going to trust you since they view you as Westerners, the enemy that goes there, that destroys their country, and now you're there to rebuild the country and give them the means to do it? I think the resistance is going to be tremendous. The same in Pakistan, the same in the Philippines, the same in Egypt, the same, I think, even in Peru. And my point is that in order for your wonderful, wonderful suggestions that I definitely think are magic, if not more, you need first to find a partner in countries that have democracy. And you can't go into countries that have dictatorships that are being supported by our government and tell them that you're going to help them because you are the Yankee, you are the enemy. So they are never going to take your suggestions, and they are always going to sabotage you.
You're making a number of assumptions that I don't share.
Well, that's why
I'm why we're having a debate on this one, and I appreciate it. When I went to Afghanistan this last May, which is the first time I personally had been back since the 1960s when I had spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, I was expecting to see a lot of anger because we were dropping all those bombs and the bombs were missing and they were hitting wedding parties, and we've all read it in the paper. Killed more Afghans than they were lost in the World Trade Center, so on and so forth. We all know those facts. I was absolutely shocked to find that almost universally, as I went from village to village, that the Afghan people were really thrilled that America was there. I really was hoping to find that they were considering us the enemy that was bombing them, because that's what I had expected to find with all those missed bombs. And they were very appreciative that the B-52s were circling up there and holding the peace because, as you say, the government in Kabul didn't have the reach to go out there, and it was only the threat of more bombs that was controlling the warlords from being nasty fellows. And so then I said, oh boy, this is changing my thinking. And then the question comes as to the partnership. Now, am I coming as an American to try to be a partner with them from our organization? Because I have a lot of the philosophical points that you agree. I don't think it's appropriate. So we started to try to find local community groups that we could teach the process to so that it wouldn't be us, the outsiders, the infidels, who are bringing this process to them. And we found some groups, and we said, okay, what do you want to call yourselves? And then they said, well, we're going to call ourselves Future Generations Afghanistan. And I said, well, I don't want that, because that looks like I'm a colonialist nonprofit setting up many future generations all over the world. And they said, but you folks are representing a philosophy of community empowerment. Future Generations is not an idea that's an American. It's a statement of a process that's happened in Kerala, in India, in Curitiba, in Brazil, and so on and so forth. It's all described in the book. Why do you so arrogantly think that just because you're white-skinned, the idea is white-skinned? And I said, well, I hadn't thought of it that way. And they said, we want to use the ideas, and we want to call ourselves Future Generations, Future Generations Afghanistan, so that we can be partners with Future Generations Peru, which, to my surprise, because I thought the Peruvians would have some problem with us being gringos, they also had adopted and had taken on themselves. But now in Tibet, where we're working, they didn't want to use the name. And they have created their own programs. And in Tibet, our projects are, in fact, going faster and in more different directions. So I am walking all around your answer. I'm not giving it straight back to you.
You're smart.
Let me follow up here and ask you to tell us more broadly, what is the most difficult part of the process for you? And what is the most difficult part of the process for the people in the community?
The most difficult part of the process for me is to get local people at, let us say, the school teacher level to understand the process. Because there is such an ingrained thinking, whether it's in India or in China or the United States, that development assistance is something you give to people. And at that level of the school teacher, they have to truly understand that advancement is something that you do to yourself, but you cannot do except by being supported. So this idea of moving forward together is an interesting and very difficult idea. Let me give you an example. We're doing this work with the White Mountain Apache in Arizona. We have a project there. And when we were talking about this with the White Mountain Apache, first of all, the Apache are very quiet people, and it's very hard to talk to them. And it's, group meetings are difficult with them. That's just not part of their culture. And so for you to insist on a group meeting is imposing your culture on their way of decision making. But after we had had an effort at discussion and they had broken up, and I don't want to go into details in the story, they came forward and saying, oh, we understand this. It isn't just and lasting change when communities own their future. It isn't healthy communities. In Apache, we say it's communities walking forward together. Okay, that made a lot of sense to me. In Tibet, when we sort of turned this over to them and they went off and they talked in Tibetan and came back in the Mount Everest region, they said, the way you're presenting these ideas they don't work for us. We need some theme to hold it all together. And I said, okay, well, how does it work for you after it's a training question I'm trying to answer. And they said, you always have to ask the question, what is the consequence of any action we take today 100 years from now? And if you ask that question, then you will be taking care of poor people, you'll be taking care of the environment, and you'll be doing the work yourself. Okay? So that the Tibetans have a question that they ask at every time they come up with a decision. In the Chomolungma region, which is what you should be calling Mount Everest, not that white man's name from England, what is the consequence of what we do 100 years from now? What is the consequence of this action today 100 years from now? So it's getting this idea of ownership across is the hardest part, Pat.
Is that the hardest for them to accept as well, or are there other parts of the process that are harder?
Yeah, the hardest for them to accept is the fact that they know that you could give them a $500 or $1,000 and you're holding that money in your pocket and you're not giving it to them. They really would say, okay, I get the general theory, but come on, give me a quick grant. Jumpstart this process.
So it's the ownership and responsibility are difficult on both sides of the table.
The antithesis of development is dependency, and you really have to get that. That it isn't underdevelopment, it's dependency.
Can I ask one more question? Because Pat brought up an issue. What you just said seems to me, and I might be wrong, that what you do in order to have them accept you is you allow them to have their own civilizations and you allow them to proceed their own way.
Yeah.
You don't proselytize. And you don't present yourself as the colonialist, whatever.
You try very hard.
In other words, you're saying that you behave like the British Empire, who used to go places and not convert them, but allow them to keep their civilization, sometimes even join in, although they ruled them, so whatever. And in your case, you don't want to do that, obviously. You want to help people develop, and also, you know, from every point of view, from their ecosystems to their economies to their poverty, the misery, the civilization. And you are successful because you do exactly this. You're not a colonialist, you're not a missionary, you allow them to take this their own way, like the Tibetans, you know, with their philosophies, what is going to happen 100 years from now, the other one, da-da-da-da-da, and you allow this. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Because that's what Pat is asking you.
What I'm saying,
How are you getting accepted?
I don't care whether I'm successful or unsuccessful. I don't care whether I'm accepted or unsuccessful, or accepted. What I care about is whether they are successful. And for them to be successful, they have to be owning the decision, they have to be gathering the data, they have to be putting their resources forward. And so that is the objective.
But every teacher has to inspire the class, otherwise the class doesn't respond. So my question is, what is your technique of inspiring them?
They see the village next door changing and they come and ask for help. The village next door. In Afghanistan, we started with some communities that asked us, but then we held back. When the government was pushing us, we held back, the current government, the Karzai government, until the news started to be carried on its own. And then we had, for instance, in the community of Jarguri, where I described the women organizing through the mosques, well, we held back there. And the next valley system over in the next province is called Daikundi. The Daikundi people said, we want you. And we said, oh, sorry, you've got so on and so forth. And they said, well, we understand that data is the most important thing, that you can't do anything for data. I said, well, that's sort of true. And so they ran around all of the Daikundi Valley, and they did survey after survey, and they came to us and said, see how serious we are. We've got all this data about our needs, and we know what we want, and now come and help us. And we said, well, you're going to expect us to pay for your school teachers, aren't you? They said, yeah, come on, pay for our school teachers. And I said, no. Now, as a consequence, in Afghanistan today, one of the real problems is that there are 148 major non-government international organizations providing assistance, and many of them are working by doing all this development by money. And so just working with the Afghans is a challenge, but actually working with all the international partners is proving to be the bigger challenge right now.
That's great.
Next question. This is kind of a follow-up to the idea of ownership, and when is the work of future generations done? I mean, do you keep working with a place for 10 years or 15 years? When do you leave it alone? And then the second question would be, what do you do if a program fails? You know, they come together and they try to save the children, but they can't fix the well water or whatever. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, let me answer the second one first. We had remember I mentioned the fish ponds? Well, near Sile is another community called Baramil. Baramil means 12 mile. And they just thought the fish ponds was a great idea, so they made a bunch of fish ponds, and lo and behold, they became malaria pits. And so they had to go and fill in all their fish ponds. And so this was sort of, they caused the problem, they had to correct the problem in next year's work plan. And what's important is that they do that process, rather than, me sort of saying, well, I really think you shouldn't build fish ponds. Now, you can ask some leading questions, because you want to always be working from successes. You can go show them some other examples. So that's one example of sort of dealing with failure. The other example of failure, of course, is, how do you cope with situations like we had recently in Afghanistan, where we had staff members who were molested, and these types of operational failures. That is a very different response. How do you cope with situations where people steal money from you and get the money back? I mean, those are other types of problems that, in fact, tend to be bigger problems than a community which tends to have a feedback loop that corrects itself. Now, you had another question, I'm afraid.
The other question is, when is your work done? When does future generations really leave the project, or what's the transition process to leave?
If you look at, take some society that has what I would say moved from what we would call third world, high rates of mortality, female illiteracy and whatnot, and moved to what one would call more equitable situation. And I'm just pulling one out of the top of the head, Taiwan, which has moved rather dramatically in the last 50 years. Or Thailand's another example. It typically now, if you let good governance and the processes of normal social change occur, it takes about 50 years for that transition. And we've got a number of examples around the world. You were referring to Costa Rica a little while ago, which sort of stands out in many of these ways. It is our assumption, and we are beginning to see evidence, that that 50-year cycle can be shortened to about 20 years right now with the technologies and the understanding that we have. And I think we're beginning to see some movement of change, for instance, in Tibet, where we're working, which in the case of Tibet, they're coming out of the 13th century. I mean, it's really a huge change that was going to suggest that 20 years maybe is a reasonable time. And that means that you've got to be there in a dialogue capacity for that period of time where you're sort of setting them up. But actually, after about 10 years, they're probably able to go on their own. Just they've picked up enough skills, and with the internet and more training and so on and so forth. One of the key points I want to mention, though, is the community has to develop hope. If the community believes that the future is going to be better than the past, then you know you've got momentum. And it is the situation of the community losing hope and getting alienated that is causing this terrorism problem, I believe, in the world today. And the loss of hope is compounded not just by let's say, the Israel-Palestine problem that is creating many in the Islamic world to feel like, they're enemies. But the loss of hope is compounded by rising disease, it's compounded by rising poverty, it's compounded by the environmental crisis. Collectively, that creates the alienation that is at the core of desperation.
Your question.
One of the questions that seems to be coming up is, you've been focusing on the how, but what happens when the how that the local people want to, that the local people take your how and then do something that you or your organization is or theoretically is uncomfortable with? What if they search for data and they find that all the landowners or all of the merchant class are of a certain ethnic group, and their solution is, let's throw out all the ethnic Indians, or let's throw out all the ethnic Chinese, or whatever it is, depending on where you are, or something that's perhaps not as black and white, and how. So that's one question: is what happens when when the community or when the organization does do something with which you're uncomfortable? And the second question that you may have to answer first is, how do you decide what that is? How do you decide what you're willing to support and what you're not?
I love the question because it challenges one with all sorts of ethical, personal things. Let me give some examples from Tibet. Our work in Tibet is driven because we believe the Tibetan environment is very delicate, being high altitude, and very precious, and so action is needed. And so, in fact, that's our belief. But most of the funding that I get for Future Generations work in Tibet is conservation-related monies. So we're out to support community-based empowerment, the development of peoples, and the money that I'm legally responsible for is conservation. So I get into a problem when the community says, oh, we need to develop. We want to put in new houses. So let's cut down some trees. In fact, let's cut down a whole forest of trees so we can get new timbers, we can sell the timbers. And I say, well, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Let's think about this. And it'd be easy for me to answer your question that I always let the communities do what they want. What I'm trying to set up is to make your problem worse, where I've got a fiduciary responsibility to donor-driven monies that will get me into trouble if I don't spend it right. So in that case, the solution that I have come up to in my own personal work, when confronted with the situation that I cannot keep my mouth shut and let the community go. If the community decides they want to build a temple and I don't think a temple's needed, I basically keep my mouth shut. But if we come up to a situation like clear-cutting a forest that I really don't want to have happen, especially this particular forest which is on the east slope of Mount Everest, and it's tremendously beautiful. Look at some of the posters in the back of the room. Or check our website out at www.future.org. But what I did then was I went to that community and says, I'm going to strike a deal with you. We're going to open, no manipulation here. This is a contract. Okay? You've got a hydroelectric plant down valley that has unused capacity. We will pay for electric wires to come up from that hydroelectric plant, just an outright gift to you. No empowerment and nothing on this one. We'll pay for those things if you agree not to cut trees because you're getting electricity in return for not cutting timber. And if you cut timber, you will agree that we can turn the power off on those power lines. So they sit down. It's called blackmail. But it is blackmail that is upfront, in a contract, and up forward. Because I think that it is in the world's interest to save that tree. And so they sit down and they have a meeting and they decide whether they want to accept the electrical lines. And they, in this case, decided they wanted to accept the lines. And then, lo and behold, a couple years later, we went over and we started to see tree stumps. And so the power switch had to be pulled. And in fact, it was only a few families that were pushing the limit and cutting the trees, but when they realized that we were going to be serious and hold to the contract, then peer pressure within the communities brought the other families in line.
I guess a follow-up to that is, as I understood it from your talk and from your answers to other questions, a lot of what your project is less the, as you said, the how, less the end result than the empowerment of communities. Right. And situations like that would seem to greatly disempower the communities, not only because you've created this blackmail situation, but because you have this outside power, you or whoever owns the power plant, that has this control to turn the switch. That would, I would imagine, potentially diminish the empowerment of the community, diminish the organizing power of the community. How does that work out?
In fact, it provides greater empowerment. Okay, and the reason is because I'm not throwing that power switch in an arbitrary way. I'm throwing that power switch because a set of rules were created and everybody bought the rules. Just as the government creates a set of rules and people agree to abide by the rules. What creates loss of empowerment is if you feel you don't know what the rules are and if you're being yanked around. And if we had put in the power lines without a contract, if we had tried to manipulate the people, then that would have been destructive. But if the people see that there is some ground rules that they can play by, they know the world isn't fair. Even here in Harvard Square, you know the world isn't fair. And so what you want to know is, what are the rules of the world, and will you play by the rules? Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to the idea of rules. You've been talking about fairly small, impoverished communities, one village, one valley, where people know each other and can talk to each other. It's not difficult to communicate. It's not physically difficult to communicate. They're very geographically based communities. But we all know that the limits of geography are becoming less important, and we all know that the outside world can impinge on these micro-communities very, very easily, and Afghanistan is a place where the outside world has impinged a lot in recent years. What impact does this global community have on the empowerment of your mini-communities, your micro-communities?
globalization is one of the truly baffling forces in the world today. And globalization isn't just what we often think of it as global economic corporations, WTO, what have you, World Bank. Globalization is also the globalization of diseases now, climate change. There are many forms of globalization that are occurring. And almost every one of these forms of globalization is victimizing communities, whether it's here in Harvard Square or whether it's in Peru. And the essential need is for communities to be able to cope with the globalization, because it's not going to go away. We're not going to take away the World Bank or the IMF. What we have to learn how to do is to respond to them. And what we have found is that the creation of this work plan process, the mobilization of communities, allows them to take the good from the globalization forces, the internet, new medicines, what have you, financing, and then to come up with strategies to deal with the bad. And if you don't do that, you are profoundly victimized. And we can see that victimization happening in our cities, in this country, just as easily as we can see it happening in poor places in Africa. And our cities in this country that are being successful are the ones that are organizing and using globalization to their advantage, taking advantage of trade treaties that have been, maybe they didn't want them, but they've got them.
Can you give some examples?
From this country?
Sure.
I think that one of the most interesting places where you're seeing thoughtful, intentional action in this country is the Adirondack State Park in northern New York, which in my judgment is far and away the best conservation project in America. It's 117 years old. Only Yellowstone and Yosemite are older parks. But what is unique about the Adirondacks is that there are people inside of it. And the people have been thrust together to learn how to work together because they were inside the blue line. Half the land belongs to the state of New York, half the land belongs to private individuals in the Adirondacks. And so as some of these global forces are hitting the Adirondacks, whether it's acid rain coming from Ohio, whether it is economic interests like Walmart moving into Lake Placid, whether it is educational policies coming out of Albany, you have a very remarkable capacity among the 106 towns within the park boundaries to organize and come up with town-by-town solutions that are very different. I could give you other examples also, but the Adirondacks is particularly interesting because each year their environment is getting healthier and more robust. The economy is improving. You know, the social conditions, educational levels and whatnot are also advancing. And so, as a first example, let me suggest a drive to northern New York.
I find this hard to imagine because the acid rain falls on all of the trees in the forest. How can an individual town with a different policy from other individual towns stop that acid rain? How can it improve the health of the forest?
You can't stop the acid rain except by political lobbying, of course, to get the power plants to change their emissions. But you can start to selectively cut the trees that are most vulnerable to open up space in the forest for the trees that are able to survive in the new ecosystem. So you're basically altering the habitat balance from what was, let's say, natural, but to make it adapt to the new environment.
And how do you, as a citizen in Lake Placid, know to do this?
Well, this is where the outside-in role comes. You don't on your own know that. But if you've got a three-way partnership going, you can be educated on your local woodplot to go after the most vulnerable trees because they're going to be sacrificed anyway.
So that is one of the main roles of the outside
that is one
partners,
of the roles.
Is suggesting solutions that the insiders may not have.
And providing training along with that, maybe also accessing financing. There depends on what needs that the inside has identified.
Okay.
ask you something that has to do with Pat's question. If I understand well, Pat is saying, how could she or I or other, lay people that are endangered, when we are all endangered species right now, and we are afraid of terrorism, although we are endangered species, find ways to fight back. And now you're saying the Adirondacks, which is a very nice example. But I think Pat asked, and I'm asking, because of the globalization, how do we save the big cities where the population lives? New York City, Washington, D.C., all the big cities, Philadelphia, you name it, here in this country. And how do we save the real lungs of this planet, like the Amazon? Now, you understand what I'm saying?
Well, I don't have the answers to many of your questions. How do we save the lungs of the Amazon? Except that I am firmly convinced that the best way of saving the Amazon is empowering the communities within the Amazon. This is not a decision that we will be able to do much from by remote control from Washington, D.C., even though we have a bunch of people in Washington, D.C. who are talking about saving the Amazon. We really need to get the people of the Amazon organized, supported, feeling that there's another future other than cutting down the trees down there. But the other side of all of this is that I don't have the full answer here, mind you. I'm not up here trying to say that we've got the universal solution. But I am saying that this is the beginning of a process that we can collectively work on together. When we first published this methodology, which is not something we discovered, it was something we observed that was already happening. When we first published this in 1995, we got a lot of criticism from all over the world. For this, the people who made suggestions, people standing in front of microphones like you saying, you've misunderstood this, you haven't done this. And so we changed the understanding, and we're revising our projects. And this sort of discussion that we're having here tonight is going to lead us to more effective solutions next year and the year after.
Because you are in India, in northeast India, in the jungle. How do you access and save something like Calcutta or Bombay?
Our work in northeast India was so successful and so interesting. If you know anything about northeast India, you know that Arunachal Pradesh is the most isolated state in India. It used to be called the Northeast Frontier Agency. A few years ago, this largest state in India, Uttar Pradesh, was divided in half. And the new state of Uttaranchal, which is the headwaters of the Ganges, heard about our work. And they invited future generations in. We were the first international group to be invited in to sign a memorandum in Uttaranchal. And they're trying to launch this whole process statewide in Uttaranchal. And it's much more urban, it's much more educated. There are a lot of Brahmins there who have their traditional caste structures. And it's moving much more rapidly than it was in the jungle because of all the human capacity there to work with. Can we do it in Calcutta? Well, we haven't tried, and let me tell you, we got enough with 80% of India. I'm not really looking forward to going into the 20% that's urban. But there are some very exciting cities in the world that are doing this type of change, and the one we describe in the book is Curitiba in Brazil. There are half a dozen cities in this country. What's happening in the city of San Francisco right now under the new leadership at the Department of the Environment in the city of San Francisco, they're moving to becoming a zero-energy city where they produce all their own energy within the city limits of San Francisco, zero waste. There are profound efforts to address some of the issues of inequity, so that we're seeing some significant leadership in the urban situation. It happens to be an area that I know very little about.
And that's why I left my house in San Francisco.
If you might, I'd like to go back to a little more specifics about the how, since that's so intriguing about the heart of your initiatives. How do you sort of work on group dynamics? You were describing when you go to a place, you're really, in a sense, building trust and relationships with people before you can possibly get into your 7-step process. Is there training? Are there approaches that will help engage people so that they really honestly understand that you are truly looking for them, for their own solutions? Because I'd imagine as you describe these places, like here in the United States, people are still somehow assuming you are either going to promote your own agenda or will come forward with funding that will tug somebody else's agenda. So how do you sort of engender that trust?
There's a wealth of skills and techniques that are developed to do that. What we have found is that once you start to do this, word of mouth means that you're being invited in. And it's hugely different from being invited in to inviting yourself in. So that you've got a local group, whether it's the president of the country or whether it's a group of outcast women, but you're coming in and they're asking for the skills. And so you have to hold back and provide them the training that they want. Now, future generations, because we were getting so many requests from around the world, people wanted Ghana, Zambia, Thailand. I mean, we weren't going to start to do this. We didn't have the resources, nor did we think it was right. So we have created this new master's degree. And so what we're now finding is that people are applying to take the master's training. Now, in order to take this master's degree, it's a little bit unusual because you can't come as an individual. You've got to come as a community. It's like you can't learn the violin without having a violin to practice on. So the person who takes this particular master's degree comes as an individual, but as an individual representing the community, and so that together they're going to engage in the process. So they've made the proactive decision that you are assuming as a body, sent an individual, by and large agreed to pay that individual so that they can get access to current world best practice. Because that's what we're offering, is to say this is the state of the art of how you can change. If you don't want to be victimized by globalization, if you don't want to be victimized by manipulative policies from a foreign aid program, and want to learn how to deal with that and take advantage of it, learn best practice.
Thank you, Daniel Taylor-Ide.